Again, this is the AMA with Virginia Postrel. Did I pronounce that right?
Yep.
Postrel. Okay.
Postrel, yeah.
Postrel. And Virginia, thank you again for being part of this AMA for your book, The Fabric of Civilization. The VRG was a few weeks ago, was 3 weeks straight. And as we were just talking about, it really was this incredibly diverse group of people. So we do have a diverse set of questions to ask you from the participants. But the first thing I'd like to know is, can you tell us a little bit about the textile that's behind you?
The textile that's behind me, I bought in India, where I took a, a printing and dyeing workshop and all on traditional methods, and also visited a number of factories. And this is a traditional Indian block print in the Indian style, as opposed to the ones that were done for markets in Europe, where it was on a light background. So in India, it was all over, uh, as you can see, dark, but they innovated to serve the European market.
Well, and
And this is new. I mean, this was made in
okay, yeah, right. This is
2019. Yeah,
you're
this is not an
you're not
antique.
hanging.
This is,
Yeah, you're not
yeah,
hanging an artifact.
yeah,
And I guess one of the questions that our group had for you um, really had to do with not only with trade and India, and we really enjoyed the whole calico, I think you say in one of your other talks, calico as cocaine.
yeah.
There was a lot of enjoyment in that particular vignette. But one of the things the group really wanted to know is, what kind of impact do you think this type of innovation and progress had specifically for the empowerment of women? And you talk about women a lot in the book, but we often get left
Yeah,
behind. So,
right,
sort of,
right.
what do you think that how the innovation and progress of
Well, it's
textiles?
interesting because we're doing this in March, which is International Women, or it's Women's History Month, and
Yeah.
yesterday was women, or anyway, whatever. And so I've been working on articles along this line and thinking about this, and it really is incredibly important in the empowerment of women. Um, but it doesn't always look like that in the short run. So, for example, women used to spend all their lives spinning, and in the short run, you had a displacement of that by spinning mills. On the other hand, that opened up, first of all, jobs for women working in spinning and later weaving mills. And there's some different gendering, like in the US, women worked in spinning mills, and in the UK, they had a slightly different technology, and men sort of used that to exclude women. On the other hand, when power looms came in, women worked on the power looms, which they were replacing male labor on hand looms. So, but the general story is of, as textiles become uh, more and more abundant, and the technologies allow them to be produced more and more by machines, that frees up women's time for other things, including jobs that are sort of made possible by this abundance. So you see the development of, outside the realm of textiles, but the development of the ready to wear garment industry, which is very much based on the sewing machines. And we tend to think of that in terms of, oh no, sweatshops, and and none of these jobs are jobs that any of us would want today. I mean, even people working in sweatshops in Bangladesh wouldn't want these jobs necessarily, because our standards of what is a job have gone up, and we're not comparing them to things like farm labor, which was very difficult. But they did offer a lot of opportunities. You could, buy a sewing machine on time and set yourself up as a dressmaker and be much more productive than you would have been, taking, I think, a week to make a shirt sewing by hand and that sort of thing. So it's all a story basically about increasing productivity. And when women's productivity grows, there's a potential for their income to grow, but also for them to do things outside of paid employment. So we also get more women sort of not working in the labor force in the late 19th to mid 20th century. Uh, there it's I'm talking over I'm lumping together lots of things because there's different issues about class and education. So
Mhm.
you open up more opportunities for education, that sort of thing. Um, and it's just, and you get women working in retailing, everything from the massive influx of shop girls in the late 19th century, which were not well paid jobs, but they were a lot of young women thought they were better than staying on the farm,
Mhm.
and
Absolutely.
there also developed career ladders for women who mostly didn't get married, but as buyers, as executives in that world, which was male dominated. I mean, I don't want to be act like this was 2021, but it's definitely, I mean, I would say that the story of the post-industrial revolution story of more and more textile abundance is one that accompanies the empowerment of women, or the giving women more options of how to earn money, how to structure their lives. I mean, things like working in one of the New England mills was a way that young women, so some of them we would call girls, I mean, teenagers, a lot of them, or would get a kind of financial independence because they would be making cash that they could spend on what they wanted to spend it on, as opposed to being back on the farm where they were dependent basically on their fathers for, and maybe their mothers, for deciding what they could spend. And you can read accounts from these mill girls of, so and so went to work in the mill because her mother, who had money, wouldn't let her spend it on fripperies and vanities because it offended her religious views. So there's this kind of independence that comes from cash employment that also grows with the development of these textile technologies.
So in that answer you gave goes really is a nice segue to the next question, because you were able to just pull from so many different avenues to build that answer, which is very much what your book does. And one of the things that was really interesting to a lot of us, especially many of us who are writing dissertations right now, there was a few of us in the group, is how did you decide what to focus on in the book? The history of
Yes.
files is every chapter is a field in and of itself. So
Yeah, yeah.
how did you
So
go through that?
the key to this book was the structure, because obviously this is a huge topic, and if you were going to try to cover it comprehensively, you wouldn't have a book, you'd have a library. Um, so what evolved started with a pretty tight structure in my proposal, but it got tighter, was this warp and weft structure where every chapter is a stage tracing the textiles from fiber to thread to
Mhm.
to cloth to dye to um, and then every chapter has a theme, and the theme keeps decides what goes in and what goes out. For example, in the chapter on dye, it's a chapter about the history of chemistry, really. And I actually wrote a whole long section that I thought was really interesting about the Pope's attempt to monopolize the alum supply and the after the fall of Constantinople, when alum was discovered in the Papal States. And anyway, and after I wrote it all, I realized this has nothing to do with the history of chemistry. So out it went. Now, the good news is I was able to publish it in Reason. So if people are interested in that story, they can either go on my website where I have a link to it, or go on Reason's website and find that. But um, so that is how I decided ultimately what went in and what went out, and how I decided what the themes were was basically what interested me. So I was interested in the idea that there's no such thing as a natural fiber, which I that themes of what is nature and what is artifice are things I'm interested in. I mean, you could go back to The Future and Its Enemies. There's a chapter on that in that 1998 book. Um, I was interested in work, particularly the work of women. And so that became kind of the theme of the thread chapter. And then while doing all of those things, and then within the chapters, I tried to organize them more or less chronologically, so that the earliest things came first and the most recent things came last. Um, and then within those themes, I try to incorporate things that are interesting, that give people a sense of the whole, not just of the themes. But and so, for example, I mean, the toughest chapter I think for most people is the chapter on cloth, because in order to understand some of the mathematics of cloth, which was kind of the theme, you need to understand looms, and looms are hard to understand, especially without any sort of three-dimensional uh, opportunity to fool around with them. And in fact, I learned to weave because I had trouble understanding them. So um, that chapter is on cloth as embodied code, but it's also the chapter where I attempt to explain this is how looms work.
Right. Without having the opportunity to have too many images. I know your book publishing is usually limited in how many images you can put in.
Yeah, and we were limited to black and white. But the main thing in that case is you really need video. You it, it and So there are links in the references to some videos that people can watch. And by the way, the references are online. So and where I have links, the links are live. So it says that at the top of the reference page in the book, because I realized that because my publisher didn't want the book to be a sea of names. There's a lot of says a historian, and we had a whole debate about whether it was an historian or one historian, or but
And
anyway.
actually, and I was wondering about you just answered it about sort of the choice, the writing choice about saying historian rather than saying the historian's name.
Yeah,
Um,
so I I've struggled with this in every book I've done. What is the best strategy for that? So in the substance of style, you never hear anybody's name. If you want to know their name, you got to look in the notes, and the notes are done in the style where it says page so and so and a few words. So it's not traditional notes. In The Future and Its Enemies and The Power of Glamour, everybody's named, and sometimes it gets a little oppressive. In this book, it's kind of a mixture. And the problem is that then there are people who are really important, like their work is really important, and some of them were really helpful and important in my research too, whose names do not appear in the text because I only named people where it was necessary, because I was quoting them in such a way that in order to tell that this was the same person that I was quoting before, you have to have their name. So one reason I wanted to put the references online, aside from the fact that that just makes life easier, is that that allows people to search for names because they're also not indexed.
Well, and one of the things we ended up doing in the VRG is because you put in either the references or enough detail about objects you were talking about that I was able to pull up like the purple and black dress from the museum
Oh
at
yeah,
MIT,
yeah.
and pull those things up. So, even though you couldn't print them in the book or look at videos of
Right,
looms, for
right,
example,
right.
but looms really are, as well as knitting, I think, if you're not doing it. It's just really difficult conceptually
Yeah.
to fully get um, what exactly is happening
Right.
in work and
And
web.
it's kind of miraculous. I mean, because everything is held together basically with friction. And one of the things that happens when you go from when weaving is invented, you it is a much more sort of friction trusting kind of cloth making than the things that preceded it, which where there was more knotting or near knotting, things like twining, where you have the warp thread and you go back and forth around it. Every warp thread is totally looped by two weft threads. So anyway, that's impossible to understand what I just did.
Right, but I can see it in my mind, but yeah, it's without doing it.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, if you Google twining, you can see what it is. But like the indigo textile, the 6,200-year-old Peruvian textile, that is a twined textile. That's a technique that was developed also in other parts of the world before weaving, and it's sort of like weaving, but is it's it's sort of what you would invent first. I mean, if
yeah,
you've done it, it sort of makes sense. Then you figure out, oh, you could invent heddles and you could lift a bunch of threads at once and do them all at once, as opposed to this much more laborious process.
well, I think we should start having our undergraduate students take a weaving class. I mean, unfortunately, we still have sewing classes, sewing machine classes,
Mhm.
but weaving classes have disappeared. I think we need to get them back in because when we talk about fibers with them and we start with thread, or yeah, we start with fiber, then thread, then yarn, then cloth. If they haven't done the weaving and they're all wearing knit, as you pointed out in the book, knit has
Right.
overtaken weaving.
It really
They
has. Yeah.
really have a difficult time kind of understanding what weaving looks like
Mhm.
because of that.
One thing that I was able to do there's the Center for Textile Research at University of Copenhagen is a big player in the world of historical. That's how I know Jane Malcolm Davies, but they're mostly archaeologists and they mostly work on archaeological textiles. And I was able to sit in on some classes that they offer where they have a course on archaeological textiles which involves a lot of that kind of thing, like learning how to weave on a warp weighted loom. um,
Mhm.
and which is not how any of your students would be weaving,
No,
but
no, no, no.
although I did take a workshop in Minneapolis making a tabletop warp weighted loom, because they were used into the 20th century in parts of Scandinavia, and the Swedish Institute there uh, does offer such classes. But anyway, my point is that it's possible to have a class where you give people little bits of techniques. So you do a
Mhm.
class where they do a little weaving. And when I got started, I actually took a sort of boot camp at the Textile Research Center in Leiden. Which I write a little bit about the weaving part of that in the book. And and that was designed essentially, I mean, anybody could take it. We had a wide variety of people in our classes. We even had like a forensic scientist. But the sort of modal person would be somebody who was a museum curator in a department that was not the textile department, but that sometimes needed to deal with textiles. And so they would need to understand some basics about textiles. So anyway, these courses exist.
Excellent. What I'm, a bunch of us have already discussed from what you put in the book that we need to, once COVID lifts and we find funding, go to Copenhagen, go to Leiden, go to,
Yeah,
some of
right.
the
It's
places,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
and see these textiles. Another question, sort of shifting gears here, is a number of the participants of the VRG are actually from the industry, the
Uh-huh.
textile industry, and so one of them really caught on to something you said, where you said that consumer producers attract our interest and sympathy. Consumers are denigrated or forgotten, yet they are at least as important. And this particular participant really saw this the opposite way because she'd been in the industry and she said everything we do is consumer driven.
Yeah, yeah.
So she was curious to know about your thinking
Right,
behind.
right. Okay. Yeah. So this is basically an old Adam Smith point that the reason we produce is in order to consume. We don't do it for, well, some of us might weave just for fun,
But
but, and so, I mean,
okay.
what she's saying is just, is basically confirming my point, which is that I wasn't talking about it from the point of view of someone in the industry who is trying to please the market. I was saying, like, when we recount sort of the history of things or we talk about them culturally, it's a little less true than it used to be, because there has been a whole flowering of the study of since the 1980s, basically the study of consumption.
Mhm.
Um, but but we tend to focus on production. I mean, look at my book. It does, it's got one chapter on consumers, and the rest is all. I mean, and it has one chapter on commerce, but most of it is on industry. It's got 5 chapters on industry. I mean, including the innovators chapter. So it is absolutely true that people in the industry have to think about consumers, and that really confirms the point that the point of the whole enterprise is because consumers want the stuff. And if you're in the industry, you're constantly trying to figure out what is it that they want. You're like the husband and wife in the cuneiform tablets
Uh-huh.
that quote where it's a husband and wife, but it's also the the production person and the marketing person. And the market, and the sort of inside guy, it's sometimes called, is saying, why can't you sell what I make? And the outside guy is saying, why can't you make what I can sell? And
Right.
and probably the reason is because, aside from the fact that information is getting lost, the consumers are fickle. And I quote one letter, but there are other letters in that sequence that really give that flavor of this is an eternal business dilemma. And until we have everything made on demand, um, instantly, it can be a problem, because even back when clothes were custom made and even the fabric was custom made, people could decide, oh, I don't like that, and
Mhm.
often the people having this stuff made had like wealth and power and were able to leave the makers wanting.
Well, and that was something we found really interesting, particularly those cuneiform tablets, is that relationship that was happening about both husband and wife, but also marketer and producer, was such an incredibly familiar relationship. It wasn't something, I think we talk about a lot of things in history that have just been lost to history that really we find difficult to connect to today. But that particular conversation, everybody went, oh, yeah, I've had conversations like that, either in
Yeah, yeah,
professional world or in the personal world, where you're trying to get your points across, and you're trying to get all of the information you need, and somehow you're missing a piece of
yeah,
information.
yeah. I
As
mean,
you said,
that's what I love about history, and especially this kind of deep history, is that it's both. You see the ways in which people who are completely different from us are the same and yet completely different.
yeah,
And so it's um, we're not worshiping the god Asur and
right.
worrying about whether, I mean, there's a lot of these letters are about, people who are worried their kids aren't being sufficiently religious and, things like that too.
Also sounds familiar.
Yeah, yeah. Although the particular form it takes is a
Yes,
little
it's
different.
a little bit different.
Yeah.
Um, and then just want to make sure I sort of have everything. I mean, I've got personally lots of questions for you, but then this becomes this becomes a 3-hour talk. Probably don't have time for that. So I think my sort of concluding question then, from the group, and you've mentioned this quite a bit, of all these different workshops that you were able to take
Yeah.
as you were doing the research for this. So did any of those classes, did you start regularly practicing weaving, knitting, dyeing?
Yeah, I do.
Um,
I don't do it as often as I would like, but I did become a weaver.
Mhm.
So I own a couple of looms. Well, actually, if you start counting all the different types, more than a couple. I own a couple of looms that I can make sort of regular fabric, and then I also own what's called an inkle loom, which you use to make bands with, um, and a and a small, like
Is that what
8 inch.
you used to post your most recent weaving piece? It was black and blue, and you were using
No,
tencel.
that's actually just a narrow piece. It's about 6 or 7 inches wide, but that's on it. That is on the loom that has been my primary loom, which is a table loom with a stand. And what that means to people who are not weavers is that one of the great inventions in the history of weaving, which was invented in China, was the idea of being able to attach different heddle bars to a pedal on the floor and raise very, like, essentially like program the loom so that you could do this sequence of steps. And my table loom doesn't have that. It has individual levers. So I have to, if I'm doing something complicated, which is actually, that piece is pretty
Mhm.
complicated, I have to hit all these levers at the top. And
Oh, it's up
it
here.
Yeah, it's up here, yeah, because it's designed to sit on a table, although I have a stand. I've I have bought from a friend a floor loom, that has pedals, but I am still in the midst of warping it, because warping the loom is the nightmare process, and I stopped partway through, and it's in I rent an office. It's in my office, but I've mostly been working from home, so I haven't been over there
Okay.
to finish it.
So weaving, in some sense, has
Yeah,
not
and
been
also I became
infused.
very active in the weaving guild. So, which is not the kind of medieval guild. I mean, it's,
Right. Oh,
obviously it's just a club, but so I do their programming now, which during COVID turned out. I mean, under normal circumstances, I would be fine at it, but it's mostly about being organized. And there's a number of teachers who, you get to give talks and give workshops. But since that has been limited by COVID, I've really tapped into my network of people who, are in Europe or
mhm.
study textile history to supplement those kinds of traditional programs. So that's been fun.
Yeah. I think a positive out of COVID has been how much we worldwide have recognized things that I think the computer world, technology world already knew, which is how we can actually use Zoom and other things to have talks like this, to
Yeah,
have
yeah,
virtual reading
right.
groups, to have and be able to pull in people from all over the world
Yeah,
in really interesting ways. Well, so you're practicing weaving regularly, and it's
yeah,
taking over your house. It sounds like.
yeah, a little bit, little
Um,
bit. Take over yeah, my living room is got a weaving corner. Um,
well,
excuse me. I've also done some dyeing,
mhm.
um, which I really enjoy, but I mostly just did it for videos because I can't let it. My kitchen is not big enough, and I don't have a backyard to. I mean, I have the woman who taught me how to weave actually has a dye kitchen in her yard, like dedicated to
Wow.
doing dye. Yeah, so I can't do that regularly. But
Let's
it
say the
has been
dye
fun.
videos were very interesting, and again, that visual to fit with what you're talking about in the chemistry chapter and the dyeing chapter, to be able to
Yeah.
see those sorts of things. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. So thank you very much again.
Thank you. This is fun.
Um, this was great, and thank you again to EconLib and to Liberty Fund. And now I'm going to turn it back over to either Shelley or Amy, not sure which, to wrap